Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to tell you to check out our upcoming events, virtual event schedule on powells.com. One of the many events that we're looking forward to is singer-songwriter Kristen Hirsch of Throwing Muses. That is next Tuesday, the 4th. She'll be in conversation with John Doe, the ex-founder of the band X. And Kristen will be talking about her new book, Seeing Sideways, a memoir of music and motherhood. And if you don't already do so, please consider following us on social media. You get all the updates, new events coming up and stuff happening in our stores as well. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Michelle Zauner and Ben Gibbard. Michelle Zauner is best known as a singer and guitarist who creates dreamy, shoegaze-inspired indie pop under the name Japanese Breakfast. She has won acclaim from major music outlets around the world for releases like Psychopomp and Soft Sounds from Another Planet. Her new album, Jubilee, is going to be coming out on June 4th. Zauner is the author of the viral 2018 New Yorker essay that shares the title of her new book, Crying in H Mart, which is an unflinching, powerful memoir about growing up Korean American, losing her mother, and forging her own identity. In her exquisite story of family, food, grief, and endurance, she proves herself far more than a dazzling singer, songwriter, and guitarist. With humor and heart, she tells of growing up one of the few Asian American kids at her school in Eugene, Oregon, of struggling with her mother's particular high expectations of her, of a painful adolescence, of treasured months spent in their grandmother's tiny apartment in Seoul, where she and her mother would bond late at night over heaping plates of food. When she moved to the East Coast for college and started performing gigs with her fledgling band, and also met the man who would become her husband, her Koreanness began to feel even more distant, even as she was finding the life she wanted to live. It was her mother's diagnosis of terminal cancer when Michelle was 25 that forced a reckoning with her identity and brought her to reclaim the gifts that her mother had given her. Vivacious, lyrical, and honest, Zauner's voice is as radiantly alive on the page as it is on stage. She's joining us tonight from Brooklyn. Joining Zauner in conversation this evening is Ben Gibbard. Gibbard is a multi-platinum Grammy-nominated singer, songwriter, and guitarist. He's the lead vocalist and guitarist of Death Cab for Cutie, which has recorded 9 studio albums, and he's also one half of the electronic duo The Postal Service. Gibbard released his debut solo album, Former Lives, in 2012, and the newest Death Cab EP, Georgia, came out in December. He's joining us tonight from Seattle, Washington. This event will also include an audience Q&A. If you have questions, please use that Q&A button to ask questions. If you see someone who's typed a question that you really like, you can give that question a thumbs up to upvote it. And more importantly, please consider supporting Michelle and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her book from us. There'll be a link for Crying in H Mart in the chat. Michelle, Ben, what a great pleasure to welcome you both. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm going to start by doing a reading, and since this is for Powell's, I thought I would read my very loving passage about Eugene, Oregon, and it just reminds me so much of what I miss of the Pacific Northwest. In 1983, my father flew to South Korea in response to an ad in the Philadelphia Inquirer that read simply "Opportunity Abroad." The opportunity turned out to be a training program in Seoul, selling used cars to the US military. The company booked him a room at the Neja Hotel, a landmark in the Yongsan district, where my mother worked the front desk. She was supposedly the first Korean woman he ever met. They dated for 3 months, and when the training program ended, my father asked my mother to marry him. The two of them made their way through 3 countries during the mid-'80s, living in Misawa, Heidelberg, and Seoul again, where I was born. A year later, my father's older brother, Ron, offered him a job at his truck brokerage company. The position afforded stability and an end to my family's biennial intercontinental uprooting, and so we immigrated when I was just a year old. We moved to Eugene, Oregon, a small college town in the Pacific Northwest. The city sits near the source of the Willamette River, which stretches 150 miles north from the Kalapuya Mountains outside of town to its mouth on the Columbia. Carving its way between mountains, the Cascade Range to the east and the Oregon Coast Range to the west, the river defines a fertile valley where tens of thousands of years ago, a series of Ice Age floods surged southwest from Lake Missoula, traveling over eastern Washington and bringing with their floodwaters rich soil and volcanic rock that now shore up the layers of its earth, alluvial plains fit for a vast variety of agriculture. The town itself is coated in green, hugging the banks of the river and spreading out up into the rugged hills and pine forests of Central Oregon. The seasons are mild, drizzly, and gray for most of the year, but give way to a lush, unspoiled summer. It rains incessantly, and yet I never knew an Oregonian to carry an umbrella. Eugenians are proud of the regional bounty, and we're passionate about incorporating local, seasonal, and organic ingredients well before it was back in vogue. Anglers are kept busy in fresh waters, fishing for wild Chinook salmon in the spring and steelhead in the summer, and sweet Dungeness crab is abundant in the estuaries year-round. Local farmers gather every Saturday downtown to sell homegrown organic produce and honey, foraged mushrooms, and wild berries. The general demographic is of hippies who protest Whole Foods in favor of local co-ops, wear Birkenstocks, weave hair wraps to sell at outdoor markets, and make their own nut butter. They are men with birth names like Herb and River, and women called Forest and Aurora. When I was 10, we moved 7 miles outside the city, out past the Christmas tree farms and the hiking trails of Spencer Butte Park, to a house in the woods. It sat on nearly 5 acres of land, where flocks of wild turkeys roamed picking for insects in the grass, and my dad could drive his riding mower in the nude if he wanted to, shielded by thousands of ponderosa pines, no neighbors for miles. Out back, there was a clearing where my mother grew rhododendrons and kept the lawn kempt. Beyond it, the land gave way to sloping hills of stiff grass and red clay. There was a man-made pond filled with muddy water and soft silt, and salamanders and frogs to chase after, catch, and release. Blackberry bramble grew wild, and in the early summer, during the burning season, my father would take to it with a large pair of gardening shears and clear new pathways between the trees to form a circuit he could round on his dirt bike. Once a month, he'd ignite the burn piles he'd gathered, letting me squeeze the lighter fluid onto their bases, and we'd admire his handiwork as the 6-foot bonfires went up into flames. I loved our new home, but I also came to resent it. There were no neighborhood children to play with, no convenience stores or parks within biking distance. I was stranded and lonely, an only child with no one to talk to or turn to but my mother. Left with her in the woods, I was overwhelmed by her time and attention, a devotion that I learned could be both an auspicious privilege and have smothering consequences. Thank you.
Hey, Michelle, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
I wasn't sure how to make an entrance after that, but first off, let me just say congratulate you on this book. I was not aware that this book had been written until I received an email about this conversation. So I was sent a copy of the book, and I just tore through it. I found it to be just unbelievably moving and beautiful. It was just an absolutely beautiful piece of work. So I guess my first question would be, what was the process from which this went from an essay in the New Yorker to becoming a full-length memoir?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited to get to talk to you. You have you know this already, but are such a songwriting hero of mine, and it's a tremendous honor to get to be in conversation with you and have you have taken the time to read my book. So thank you very much for your time. I started this book, the sort of seed of the idea, in 2016. I wrote another essay called Love, Loss, and Kimchi, and it started as kind of a shorter, cuter piece about this woman, Mangchi, who is a Korean YouTube vlogger, who I was learning how to cook these Korean dishes from, and I thought it was sort of like a Korean Julie and Julia. And at the time, I had sort of put my music ambitions to the side, and my mom had just passed away, and I was trying to climb the corporate ladder in New York and working this horrible job in advertising as a sales assistant. And so I would go to work and just be at the computer from like 8 to 7 and come home feeling like I just had done nothing with my day. And so in between, after work, I would either mix this record that I had made in Eugene before I left, or I would start trying to write down, I was just trying to do little creative projects to like help me feel something. And of course, no one wanted it. I shopped it to every like food blog and essay contest that didn't have an entry fee. And 9 months later, I found out that I won Glamour Magazine's Essay of the Year. And that process sort of made me realize that, there was a much larger story to tell. And so when my band and I went to tour in Asia in 2017, I stuck around Seoul for 6 weeks, and I started writing the beginning of this book, and sort of, I think I was just really interested in a number of things. There was part of the really painful stuff that I wanted to write to just kind of process what had happened. And there was a lot of joyful stuff that I wanted to try to really lean into and relive and remember and get down and sort of archive. And so then the New Yorker approached, the New Yorker and I were in conversation about submitting a piece in 2018. And so I gave them the first chapter that I had already been working on. And from there, the piece just like blew up and went viral. And I was approached by a number of agents and publishing companies, and had the means to finally spend the time to turn it into a book. But a lot of it was also written on tour, like in vans and on planes and in between shows, sound checks and showtime, the sort of initial stages of the book writing.
I mean, that's just really impressive to me that you are able to harness any semblance of creativity on the road. I mean, I have tried to write songs or to kind of jot stuff down, and it seems like touring at this point is just a succession of hotel rooms and like Will Ferrell movies. There isn't a lot of there's not a lot of creativity happening on the road. So I'm really impressed that you were able to pull that off. So you would keep, you would just kind of be chipping away at this book in the process of being on tour at the same time.
I would say the sort of initial stages. I think that like for the more serious stuff, I feel like so much of writing a book is the work is in the revision process. And for a lot of the sort of raw source material where I was just kind of like blurting out garbage for a while happened largely on the road when, there was a lot of like sort of free thinking. And I had this kind of goal every day that I would write 1,000 words, even if they were just total gobbledygook. And like, until I reached 90,000 words, and then I would go in and start sort of revising and trimming the fat. So, to not give myself too much credit, a lot of real garbage was written on tour, and all of this sort of like raw source material that ended up me needing to be in one place for a while to actually like wrap my head around the revision and the structure of the book.
Well, and that's the essence of being a writer of any discipline, right? Is you're throwing away 80 to 90% of what, at least I am. I'm throwing away so much more than I'm actually keeping, and it's in all of the raw material that you kind of find. You find the record, or I'm assuming in this case, you find the book amongst all that raw material.
Yeah, I feel like my process for writing this book is very different from songwriting, because I don't think that I actually. Maybe I'm not giving myself enough credit, but I feel like I don't do too much revision in songwriting. I am like kind of everything is good. Like for first thought is best thought for most of the time. So that's really interesting to me that you do a lot of revision and lyric writing for your material.
Well, I write a lot of songs, and most of them are not any good. And then
Yeah.
I try to cull the stuff that is actually working. But I'm always impressed with anybody who's able to kind of write anything long form, especially like a book, because, you know, as you know, as a songwriter, you know, you got 3 verses, a couple choruses, maybe a bridge. You know, there's a lot, you have a lot less space to say something. And I've always enjoyed that limited space. So as a songwriter, I know you have a background in creative writing, but going from being a songwriter into trying to write something long form, did you find that there were any kind of self-imposed barriers from working within the context of being a songwriter, where you have these forms that are of a shape that you only have so much room, and then in writing this book you have total freedom, I would assume, to just kind of write as much or as little, say as little or as much as you want to say? Did you find that to be the case? What was that like, that transition from being exclusively a songwriter to writing something long form like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one benefit of writing songs is that you get, you know, only the best lines make it in. Whereas like here, like you have a lot of like, you know, lines that just have to move the moment from point A to point B. And sometimes that's like, you have to just write a boring line like, we went to this location, you know what I mean? And there's nothing beautiful and exciting about that. Whereas like every line kind of fires off in a song, and you can write in these sort of really punchy fragments sometimes. And, you know, editors really don't like it when you do that in a book. So that was a real, you know, process of kind of writing in this different way. And I think I went into it pretty cocky. And I think that from the one thing that I took with me, like from making records, was that I had this confidence that I had been able to see a number of larger creative projects through, because I had written 4 albums before I started this book in earnest. And that being said, I've never felt just like more like confrontation with my own stupidity than I had when I was writing this book, just because there's sort of nothing to hide behind, and it's very lonely and isolating. And you know, like a lot of music is so collaborative, and if something's not working, you can switch to another instrument or you can try on another song, whereas this is a lot of just like hunched over a laptop, like crying over the screen.
So would you agree with the adage that the thing that writers hate the most is actually writing?
Totally.
Which that seems to be the most. I mean, in my limited capacity as just a songwriter, I find that sometimes there's moments where you feel like you're flying, right? And you feel everything that's kind of coming out of your fingers or that's going onto the paper is just really working. And then there's those long periods of at least for me, long periods where I'm not getting anything that I'm particularly proud of, or that I can see becoming anything on an album. So I guess when you're writing this book, did you have also periods like that where you know, you said you were kind of writing it somewhat stream of consciousness, but would you go through a period and say like, wow, I fucking killed that section? And would you have times where you were like, oh man, I just spent like 2 weeks writing this thing and I don't have anything?
Absolutely. Yeah, there were certain passages that I had worked on for some time, or just flew out, that was like, oh yeah, like you're, you know, I think that even with music too, it's like you either go from being like, I'm a complete genius, to like, I'm a total like sniveling little worm. And I definitely felt that so much in writing this book. There were certain passages that were just impossible, and I had to, you know, return to over and over again. Months and months would go by, and I was still never quite sure that it was good. But sometimes, you know, you return to those chapters, I feel like the ones that are really hard, and something just clicks, and it's so annoying, because like it really just took working at it for so long to just get it right and figure out what it needed. And I think that that's like all you really have is an artist, is like your ability to like sniff out your own bullshit, and whether or not something is working or not. I remember reading an interview with George Saunders where he was talking about revision, and just like there being sort of like a green light, red light, yellow light in your head when you're rereading, and when that starts to go off, you know when it's not working. And even though you want it to work, like deep down there's a gut feeling that you know that something is not working. That being said, I had a question for you actually that might be kind of sad, but hopefully isn't sad. For my third record, which I just, which will be coming out later this year, and for this book, that being said, disregard everything I just said about knowing whether or not something's good or not. I had this strange sensation where this sort of like novelty of completing an album had sort of worn off by the third record that I had made. And I remember I went to a bar with, this is pre-pandemic, I went to a bar with my drummer and co-producer, and we were just sort of like, yeah, I mean, that's it. And I just didn't feel that same feeling of like, we killed it and it's great. And similarly with this book, when I turned it in, I was just devastated because I thought that I had let myself down. I had let my mom down. It wasn't like, I couldn't quite get to like where I wanted to, like I envisioned my intelligence, hitting. And I wondered, like, as someone who's made so many records, if you ever felt the same way as you grew, that like that sort of novelty wore off and you didn't have that same kind of certainty, and it just was what it was for that time. Does that make sense at all? Does that?
It does. I don't think that anything compares with finishing what will be your first record, and certainly in a time of, I remember getting the CD of our first album, Something About Airplanes, back from the press in 1998, and holding this thing, and Nick and I, our bass player, holding it, and just we couldn't fucking believe that we had made a record, and there's that just wonder, the wonderment of like having, like, other people made records, you listened to them, and those records made you want to make music. Well, here is a record that you made, and certainly at that point, and even to this point, I don't think about it in these terms, but that somebody will hear that record and maybe they'll want to make a record too. Maybe this little collection of 9 or 10 songs will become something that other people hear and then inspires them to make their own thing. But kind of getting specifically to your question, I feel that the earlier records, that I still get that feeling of when I finish a record, I'm just so proud of it. I listen to it, and it's the encapsulation of sometimes years of writing, and it is its own little statement of, for me as the songwriter, this is my own little yearbook of the last 2 or 3 or whatever years of writing that are in this little piece of work. So I still get that feeling of being really excited and proud of the record when it's done. Nothing can compare to the first one, of course, but I think what's changed for me over the years is that I think when an artist or a band is first starting, there's more at stake with every album. So people hear your first record, you've come out of nowhere, and they're like, what's the second record gonna be like? And then, oh, it's the difficult third record, and then, it's like, there's this pattern. There's the first record, the second record tends to be songs that didn't make the first record, plus some new songs that you wrote, which is absolutely the case with us. The third record's a difficult record. That was our difficult record.
Just because I'm on my third record, do you mind talking? It's a photo album, right?
It was photo album, yes, yeah. So I think.
Do you mind telling me a little bit about where you were at, like, for your third record, and like what was going on? Because I just, this is my third record, and I had so many like ideas of what a third album should be, and I'm curious, like, where you were at in your career, and like, just because I want to like map my feelings onto the way that you might have felt when your third album came out. And one of my favorite records of yours of all time.
It really is photo album.
Yeah, I think that I think that I probably around the age that I discovered Death Cab for Cutie, it was photo album era, and I remember I Was a Kaleidoscope is on that record, and listening.
Yeah. Totally.
Like every winter, like, because it's like a winter song.
Well, I guess, there are these kind of tropes in rock and roll for a reason, right? And, it was the case for us. The first record was you have your whole life to write your first record. I'm sure you've heard that, right? And then the second record will be some of the songs that you wrote around the time of the first record, but they didn't make the first record, so they become part of the second record. And then some songs you wrote in the 6 months between those two records. But I find for us, the third record was a complete clean slate. There was no material to fall back on that we had written, or that I had written for the first two records to kind of reference or pull stuff from. So I think in some ways the third record, most artists' third record, if they follow this pattern, which in my experience has been fairly, people have kind of followed that trend to some extent. The third record is a really kind of interesting fork in the road, because I believe that a lot of bands, a lot of artists begin anew at that third record, and they might end up in a direction that is very different from the first two, which of course, might upset fans of the first two records. They've totally changed. They're not like the first two records. But I found that our third record, certainly for me, represented, a different, it was a shift, and it was a different road to go down that was very different from the first two. But that was also, that was also a very difficult time in our band. So I'm sure, you feel the same way when you remember everything that was going on in your life when you were making that record. And that in some ways has colored my feelings about the record. But we still play songs from that record, and, I love it when people say that they dig it. And so, yeah, that would be my take on it. I think the third record it's very unique in any artist's catalog because it sits in its own space. And I have not heard yours yet, but I'm stoked. I'm sure it's going to be fucking great. And I guess to bring it back around to the book, one of the things that really struck me about this book, and knowing you as I know you, and obviously being a fan of your music, I feel one of the reasons that we are all connected to music while we're all fans of music is because it really it takes us back to place, and it takes us back to times in our life. You hear a song, you had a favorite song when you were 13, that song comes on in a bar or something like that. You're immediately right back there, and you're talking to your friend like, oh, when this song came out, I was and did it, and you're talking, but food and your olfactory senses, your sense of smell, your sense of taste are very similar. So I found it really striking in this book that you as a musician were writing, for obvious reasons, having read the book, were able to write so eloquently about food. So I wonder if you could kind of talk to that observation of, how being a musician and how music is connected to memory put you in what I believe is a unique place to write about food.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually, I've been talking a lot about, this has become a really cringy buzzword in talking about this book. It's kind of like the new songstress, but the term love language has been tossed around a lot about, but I mean, to be fair, I do think that, both food and music are sort of universal in this way. One thing that hasn't come up is that is so true, that it really does take you back to a time and a place. And that's something that I certainly think about your band so much I feel very taken back to a certain period of my life when I listen to your records. And that's a really thoughtful observation. I think that, it was so easy for me to write about food in a way, because it's such a, it's so, it activates all of your senses, and it's a very, very rich thing to write about. And another great thing about writing about food is that, if you've forgotten what something tastes like, you just do research and eat the thing again. And you get to sort of interact with it. And in that way, you can interact with music constantly and sort of, you have control over it. And I think that that's one thing that one of the many reasons I sort of ended up turning to food in the wake of loss was because it was this thing that was in my control. It felt like I was working towards something. And also, as someone who's not religious or particularly spiritual, it was a way for me to sort of carve out this quiet ritual for myself to like participate in at least like half an hour of my day, to just quietly focus on a sort of task at hand that's very tactile, and use that time to kind of remember my mom and think about her and feel like I was preserving something. And I think in some ways music has a similar sort of quality as, you know, like nowadays it's like we are always doing a million things at once. And so if you take the time out of your day to actually just like sit and listen to music, I think it can be similarly sort of ritualistic and transportive.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think that one of the things about music and food that I find that are unique, I guess I would consider food a particular type of art form, but certainly as music as an art form, it's really one of the only art forms where that is portable, and that you can interface with it over and over and over again. You know, I have my favorite movies, I have my favorite books, I have my favorite TV shows, I have my favorite actors, whatever else. But you know, if you have a favorite song, you can listen to it whenever you want, and it takes up whatever 5 minutes of your time. You can listen to it over again in the subway. It's much more difficult to sit down and watch your favorite movie every time you feel like interfacing with that art form. And I feel that food is similar in that sense, where if you have a favorite type of food, or if food triggers a particular memory for you, as music does, you can either make it or you can go to that place that serves that particular thing that triggers that memory for you. And, you know, I think it's one of the things that's so unique about what you and I do for a living, in the sense that, you know, we make things that people can kind of take with them and experience whenever they want to. They don't have to be in a particular space. They don't have to set aside 2 hours of their day. They don't have to, you know, and I find that food, you know, it's like we all have those places, like you land in fill in the blank, and you're like, the first fucking thing I'm doing is I'm going to that bao stand, and I'm getting that bao, or I'm getting that slice of pizza, whatever it is. And so do you have those places, you know, I don't know how often you get, well, nobody's getting back to anywhere these days, but when you do end up getting back to Seoul, do you have like a list of places where like, we're going here, then we're going there, and then can I have that list for whenever
you've played Seoul though, I imagine?
We have played Seoul once, and we have somewhat of a funny story about it, if
Please.
we have 2 minutes. Okay. So we were asked by an artist named Sataji to play his festival. Are you familiar with Sataji? Nor was I. So apparently, we get to Seoul, and something was going on with me. I wasn't able to be at this thing, but the band was rushed into a press conference, which was like hundreds of cameras, photographers, and they were asking questions like,
what album cycle was this on?
Well, this was on Narrow Stairs, but we were on a bill of many bands that Sataji had curated. We were down the list, and they were asking questions like, "How honored are you that Sataji asked you to play his festival?" And thankfully, everyone was like,
really honored.
Caught on very quickly, like, "Yeah, this is a really huge honor for us," and we're like, we don't know who this guy is. Like, we just know that someone booked us a show in Seoul, and somebody might have mentioned it to us, but it didn't register. So we go on Wikipedia, and the Wikipedia entry for Sataji says something like, the only analog to his popularity in Korea is Michael Jackson in America in the 80s. So it was somebody had probably said, it would be like if somebody's like, "Hey, Michelle, does Japanese breakfast want to open up for Beyonce?" They wouldn't need to explain who Beyonce was, because you'd be like, "Oh, it's Beyonce. Yeah, of course, I know who Beyonce is." But because of the culture gap, we didn't know. We didn't.
Guy, or was he like a K-pop person, or?
He was kind of like a pop star. He was, yeah, kind of a K-pop guy. And he was really nice. We obviously, we felt mortified. We were like calling everybody back home, like, "What the fuck did you tell me this guy's like super famous?" Because we didn't. We felt this could have gone a number of really bad ways. But we met him. He was really great. The show was bizarre, but it was a very auspicious start because, as I said, it would be like if, hey, do you want Beyonce wants to play this festival? Oh my God, Beyonce! Yes, of course we'd love to do that. We didn't have any reference for it.
Yeah.
That was the only time we played in Seoul, and I would love to get back, but we just haven't. It was wild. It was totally wild, and it was in a baseball stadium. It was like where the Doosan Bears played. It was this giant, tens of thousands of people. Marilyn Manson was on this show.
Oh my God,
wild.
That is wild. That is so wild. That is so funny. Yeah, I was gonna say because there's this the vinyl bar is where. You've played have you been to Beat Cafe in Tokyo? Beat
No.
Cafe is like this place in Tokyo where I feel like all of the bands go, like after their maybe the smaller bands go after their shows in Tokyo.
Old. I'm an old man. I don't go out like I used to.
And I feel like in Korea that spot is called Gopjang Jeonggol, which actually like translates to like awful stew. But they don't serve that there. It's just like a cool record bar. But that's sort of like towards the end of my book where I talk about going. So now I always go there, and I always go to Samwon Garden, which is like this fancy barbecue spot that my family and I always went to, and this place called Myeongdong Kyoja, which is this like kalguksu, like beef noodle restaurant that's really good. So I do have those spaces for me, and I have a lot more now that I've spent more time as an adult in Korea, because when I first started, my only memories up until like the last few years was just like being sort of carted around by adults and not really knowing where I was ever. So my relationship to Korea is so different now because I have gone there as an adult and stayed there for prolonged periods of time in sort of different neighborhoods that my mom never would have taken me to, because she wouldn't be hanging out in like, the Brooklyn of Korea or whatever. So yeah, I have such a different relationship to it now, and different sort of fun spots that I get to go to. But yeah, I'll definitely put together a list for when you get to play your show in Seoul again.
I know. Love that. And one thing that I pulled out of my record collection, which you referenced at some point, was this.
Yeah.
It's in the glare. Yeah. I love this record, and I was like, oh yeah, Shinjin. I think I have.
He's on there, I think, and it's so good. Yeah, and I didn't know about him at all until we went to this vinyl bar, and the promoter introduced us to his music. And actually, yeah, then my aunt, I later discovered that my aunt listened to him when my mom was a kid, and they used to sing his songs together.
Well, yeah, and it's wild. I found that when we were there, I mean, this was obviously before, I mean, I guess K-pop was happening at that point, of course, but it certainly wasn't the phenomenon that it's become, where it's kind of transcended just people in Korea and Asia kind of being into it. But it's in my, I don't have a lot of knowledge about this stuff, but it has been really. What's that? Yeah, it could be, right? Yeah, exactly. But it is interesting how there's been this, incredibly kind of insular and really creative scene going back. I mean, I didn't know about Shin Jung-hyun. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Shin Jung-hyun.
Yeah. Until Light in the Attic put this record out, and it's psychedelic as shit. Like, it's really fucking good.
Yeah, he's kind of like the full specter of Korea, and like yeah. I mean, I never really heard of like any Korean music growing up, especially nothing like beyond K-pop, and so that was such a wonderful discovery. There's a lot of like really great Korean funk music that I discovered later on that I'm really into.
So it sounds like you've kind of been able, over the years, you've kind of developed your own relationship to Seoul and to Korea. Do you feel how much of that relationship formed with your mother, and how much of it has been formed posthumously as you've kind of been traveling the country, with you and your husband, or other members of your extended family over there?
Yeah, I think a lot of it. I don't think I was as interested in Korean culture before my mom passed away. You know, I just didn't think about it so much. It wasn't a huge part of my life because it just felt so like intrinsically like tied to me. I just like never questioned it or like thought about it. And then it was only after she died that I think that I just really leaned into that part of my culture because I was really worried that I was going to lose it if I didn't like actively work to sort of preserve it. And the only way I could think to do that would be to, you know, cook these dishes and travel to Seoul more often and become more involved in the culture and interact with it in these sort of more active ways, I guess, than I had before. So yeah, my relationship has changed so much. I don't think you know, and I never thought I was going to write nonfiction. I when I studied creative writing in college, I had only taken fiction writing courses, and I took pretty much every course that my professor had to offer except for his nonfiction course, because I just never thought that I would write nonfiction because there would be too much pretext. So my husband is like in the corner right here popping his head in because he's such a big fan and we sing your albums in the car so often. So he's like watching this. But yeah, I think that it wasn't, you know, until after my mom passed away that I felt this real sense of urgency to tell our story and explore her in this way and explore my heritage, because I was suddenly so afraid of losing it. And I was afraid that I didn't have rightful access to her family anymore either. And I felt very nervous about even like reaching out to her sister anymore. Even though we were close when I was a kid, it felt weird. Like, that's my mom's family. And if like she's not here anymore, am I allowed to reach out to them? Or is it just, am I being a burden by you know, making them be involved in my life in this way? Were they only sort of tending to me out of duty to my mom? And there were all these just like neurotic like feelings that I had. And so yeah, it was a really new thing. My mom would think it was so weird that I'm like really into this stuff now.
Well, you know, as the passages you read from the book is, you know, about Eugene. And I know Eugene, of course. It's a town we've played 1,000 times, and it's also a very, very, very white place. And you know, I guess I'm curious if it's even my place to ask, as you know, someone who is both, you know, is mixed race, Caucasian and Korean. You know, how your sense of yourself has changed from when you were young, living in this very white town, and you know, as you write about in the book, kind of being a little bit embarrassed is too strong a word, but you know, bringing Korean food. I think you write about bringing Korean food to lunch as a kid, and kind of having that be when you're kids, you want to have Twinkies and ding dongs, and you want to like be like, no, it's like you want to have everybody wants to conform to kind of what everybody's supposed to be eating or saying or doing. And I guess I'm curious, you know, what your journey has been like from growing up in Eugene and having that be kind of your Korean heritage being something that you seemingly, I'm just saying from reading the book, you seem to kind of want to downplay a bit, and that how did you go from that to embracing it as you have, you know, in the process of writing, not, you know, that culminated with the writing of this book, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I started just being really not you know, I felt like as a kid it was something that made me very special to be like a rare you know, like mixed mutt in the US, you know, and I felt like I got the best of both worlds in a way, like having you know, being mixed race. And then it wasn't until adolescence that I think that everyone, you know, any sort of difference that you have like is just mortifying, because everything at that age is just mortifying. Like the smallest any small thing that like makes you different, if you're like a little bit chubby, or like if you are a different race, or if you have like a lot of freckles, or you know, whatever, it's like you just overanalyze everything, and it's the most embarrassing thing in the world. And so I think that was the sort of age that I became just so freaked out. I think that the thing that really made me so I just like wanted to be a neutral body, and especially as a creative person, I wanted everything to be about my work and like my craft and not my identity. I didn't want people to assume things about me. I didn't want people to have a like I didn't want there to be a stereotype before they even met me. I didn't like the idea that if I went to a party and someone asked my friend, who did you come here with? I would be, oh, the Asian girl, And so I feel like there were certain things that I would begin to sort of act out of my way to like kind of, have it be in my control or something. And, I would do certain things like, I would just try to downplay like those differences and one really sad thing is that, my middle name is Changmi, which was my mother's name. And I would pretend that I didn't have a middle name because as a Michelle Zauner, you would have no idea that I'm Asian if you saw my name on paper. And that gave me a feeling of power in a way. And then I think just with age in general, you become more comfortable with like who you are and you recognize that that's such an intrinsic part of who you are and you come to appreciate it. And I think that, that was like one thing that was so sad about my relationship with my mother is that I think that a lot of people have this sort of renaissance period with their parents when they're in their early 20s where you sort of like shed the hormonal shitty adolescent behavior and you get to return to your parent as almost like a peer, and you get to enjoy this sort of new relationship with one another where you can confide in one another and talk to each other as adults. And we had just sort of hit that sweet spot where I was like in my early mid 20s and we were able to, I had started to really accept who I was. That being said, I was still, playing in a band. I was in another band called Little Big League. And I remember I would do certain things just because I felt like I had to in order to be taken seriously. Like I remember when we would line up to take a photo and the photographer would be like, oh, Michelle, step up. I would be like, no, like I have to be always in line with the guys. And I would sort of dress up like more masculine. And I would write these like overcomplicated kind of guitar parts just because I wanted so badly to be taken seriously. And so any question about, back then they wouldn't have even thought to ask me about my racial identity, but, I did things like that to sort of be taken seriously as like a woman in music, because I didn't want to be different. I didn't want anyone to feel like I was good because of my gender or anything. I just wanted to be on the same sort of ground block, in the same way that I think that in some ways I never wanted to write nonfiction because I always wanted to just write literary fiction. I wanted to be taken seriously as a writer and not pigeonholed as like some kind of cultural ambassador,
Yeah, that's very well put. Okay, so I think we're getting close to winding down. So I've been instructed to throw some questions to you from the Q&A if you're down for that.
Yeah.
Okay. This is one of the first questions that popped up, and I was going to ask. It kind of took my question, so I'll just give Amy credit. She asked, Michelle, would you consider writing a cookbook including all the incredible sounding dishes from your book?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like so many of the recipes that I follow are just Mangchi's recipes, and I don't really have too many new ones of my own. So I can't imagine. I might make like a little zine or something with like just a few things that I know how to make that I feel like are kind of more unique to me. But I feel like the things that I make at home aren't like really reinventing the wheel. And so I don't feel like I am by any means a chef. So I don't think so.
Well, I think you should. That's just me, because that's just me. I think it's worth doing. Because I think that, as I was reading your book, I'm in no way overly versed in Korean food, but, I know the basics. And there were just so many, just the descriptions of how the food was being made, and then what the food, the presentation of the food afterwards was, it was just very vivid, and just, it'd be kind of cheesy to say that it made me hungry. That would be like, if we were on a bad talk show, I'd be like, it made me hungry, Michelle. So, maybe not, hungry is not the right word, but it definitely was like, oh man, I want to yeah, I gotta go down to Koreatown. I gotta try some of this stuff. Or like I haven't heard of that. I need to try that. So I think you should. I think people after they read the book, I think they'll want some guidance. Okay. Let's see. There was somebody says here. Okay, somebody asks. Christina Hall asks, I found a lot of similarities in what you shared about your mother. Do you have any advice on managing an Uma's expectations and bluntness / harshness?
Oh, that's so sweet. Gosh, I mean, I think for me, perspective is everything, you know, like there were so many times that I resented my mother for how critical she could be. But I think that the best thing to do is try to know that like there's a big cultural divide, you know, in that. And to kind of, I feel like you have to think of your mom in this, you know, in this different context where like that is more normal for that culture, and to try to find what exactly, I guess like what lies beneath that. Like, I feel like a lot of that sort of critical nature is, I mean, it's easier to say when you're not coping with it, but I feel like a lot of that critical nature, like deep down is just like masking this real desire for you to achieve your ultimate greatness or something, or like there is like some masked like real love shit that's like going on beneath those types of criticism, and learning how to sort of see through that.
Awesome. Let's say Rachel Frankel asked, did you listen to any specific albums or musicians while writing? If so, which ones? Which is actually a question I wanted to ask as well. Was there, you know, are you able to listen to music while you're writing? Is that distracting? Do you have to, and if so, are there, well, I guess, what were you listening to? If anything, what were you listening to when you're writing the book?
Yeah, I feel like I can't listen to music really when I am writing or really doing anything. I get so distracted by it. I think that there might have been some days that I like listen to more kind of like ambient instrumental music, like Brian Eno or something, or like more classical stuff. And then, you know, there are a couple of songs that I listen to kind of get me in the headspace of certain chapters. Like there's a song on that Shin Jung Hyun compilation called The Sun, and in Korean it's Hennim by Kim Jung-mi. And that song to me is like the perfect thing to listen to after you finish this book. And if my book were to be a movie, that's how it would end. And then, you know, listening to Coffee Hanjan and by the Pearl Sisters, and writing about that song. There were certain songs that I had to sort of re-listen to get to write about in here. Like I wrote about opening for Maria Taylor, and so I had to, you know, re-listen to that record, which I loved so much as a teen, to sort of remember how to write about that moment.
I love that you also wrote about Isaac living down in Cottage Grove. I don't know if you mentioned Cottage Grove, but you were like, I heard his cousin lives around here or something like that. That's Cottage Grove, and it's weird as fuck down there. I'll no disrespect to anybody from Cottage Grove, but you know what I mean. It's weird. It's a weird place. There's a weird energy in Cottage Grove. I don't know what it is. It's kind of like a very spooky. Yeah, it's very, very bizarre. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Nari Kim asks, Michelle, are you currently practicing Korean? If so, what resources, apps, tools do you use? And there are 2 eye emojis. Like the 2 eyes.
I am taking a little break right now just because I have been really busy with press and stuff. But for a while, I was seeing a number of tutors on this website called Live Lingua once a week, and it was fun, like getting to be a student again and make that sort of time commitment to those lessons. And they were another really helpful therapeutic tool for me at that time, and I've keep wanting to go back, and I've also been wanting to watch more Korean TV shows. There's this one show that I loved called Intercontinental Summit, I think it's like what it's called. I forget the Korean title, but it's basically like all of these men sit at this like round at this table, and they're all from different countries, but they all speak Korean fluently, and they talk about being foreigners in Korea. So there's like a guy from Ghana, and there's a guy from France, and there's a guy from Spain and Canada and the UK, and they all like speak Korean like perfectly, and it makes you like so upset because you're like, God damn it, like I'm Korean and I like can't speak as well as this guy from like Ghana or like this guy from Canada. And so that show is really great, and I feel like when I was watching it, I was picking up on a lot of Korean.
Okay. Yeah, I would imagine that I speak very poor Spanish, but I've noticed that it's very difficult if you're not speaking it every day, and it comes at you really fast. If language comes at you a lot quicker than you even realize it, I feel like. So it's something I'm trying to be more conscious of when I'm speaking to somebody who English is not their first language. Okay, let's do 2 more here. Lee Ko asks, will there be a second book? If so, any ideas about what it might be?
Yeah, I feel like I would love to write a second book. Maybe not anytime too soon, but I feel like I just learned so much in writing this book that it feels like so enticing to write another book just so I could apply that knowledge to the next one. And I think that, I should maybe like not talk about this so much, but I can't lie. So I think that the natural jumping off point for me is actually sort of goes along with the question before, where I would like to spend a year in Seoul and finally become fluent in the language at some point in time and sort of document that process, because another frustrating thing about this book was it's so rooted in memory, and that was really hard to like remember all of this stuff. So I think that is really enticing, because I don't think I'll ever become fluent in this language unless I make a project out of it. And I'm really into like writing a book that's largely happening in present time, and sort of keeping a diary about learning the language and that sort of progress, day-to-day progress.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And that would be a really kind of cool thing to see, honestly, if you were documenting it in, for like an actual documentary or something like that, because, because it is so difficult to become fluent in a language, and to see somebody's, going through it in real time, I think would be pretty profound. Okay, last one. It's kind of like this is a tour guide question. Michael Miranda says, hey, Michelle, I just moved to Portland, Oregon, and have never lived outside of California before, ! What are some places you recommend seeing / going to in Oregon, and any food recommendations you might have?
I honestly haven't spent too much time in Portland beyond like obviously going to Powell's, visiting, and going to like the Crystal Ballroom, like House of Rec, or like what is the record shop?
Everyday Music. Yeah, you play Crystal Ballroom, and then you go to Everyday Music, and then you go to Powell's, and then you go to Sizzle Pie, and then you write.
My God, I used to. Do I call them? So I used to work at Sizzle Pie.
I know you talk about it in the book. Yeah.
Hellish. For Eugene, I feel like Spencer View Park is important. I love Newman's Fish and Chips and Cafe Yum, which is a thing that maybe only Oregonians really like. But you should be giving advice. You lived there for quite some time, no?
No, I didn't. My wife is from Portland.
You are so like associated with Portland, though.
Yeah, our Chris Walla, who used to be in our band, he lived in Portland for a long time, and Dave, our guitar player, lives in Portland. So if Dave were in the chat, he should be the one giving everybody the Portland recommendations. For me, I am most saddened that Pok Pok is no longer in Portland. They had these wings, these like spicy wings that they're like one of the only foods that I've kind of come in contact with that, like, there's stories about super famous people like that. Oprah would have this one kind of, she would have it flown in or something, or that like Elvis would take him and his Memphis Mafia.
The thing is Pop.
They would like fly to somewhere in Vegas to get this sandwich, and they would fly back to Memphis, like crazy shit like that. Like, I think those Pok Pok wings are one of 2 or 3 food items that I would want to have flown to me, or that I would want to fly to if had an egregious amount of disposable income and could do that kind of thing. But even if we did, that's probably not the kind of shit we would do anyways. So yeah, I'm not. Things seem to change in Portland so quickly that and being in Seattle and having not been to Portland in so long because of the pandemic, it's difficult for me to say. But yeah,
that bar, the arcade bar, like Ground Control, I think it's called.
Yeah, it's
Ground Control is like a cool arcade bar, and then my friend took me to this brunch spot. I don't know if it's there anymore, called Sweetie D's, I think, and I think that place was cute. And
I'll have to ask Rachel or Dave. I'll have to text Dave after this. Well, this has been so fun, and I'm so honored to have been a part of it. And Michelle, let me just say that there's when doing these kind of promotional kind of things, there's this desire to lean into hyperbole and to kind of talk up things for the sake of talking them up. And I have to say in all sincerity that your book really was incredibly powerful and really moving, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm not just saying that to help you sell books. It's very true. And I would please everybody who's watching here, if you've enjoyed this hour and this conversation, please order the book. And if you can't order it from Powell's, even though I live in Seattle and we have a wonderful bookstore down the street in Elliott Bay, I buy virtually all of my books from Powell's. Don't tell them that, but I mail order almost everything from Powell's because they have everything. And I'm sure they have hundreds of copies of this book waiting for you to buy them. So Michelle, congratulations. It's a wonderful piece of work. And I'm hoping that we can cross paths somewhere in the real world, because, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, I would prefer to do this in person, and I'm glad we got to do it like this, but I would prefer to do it in person.
I hope that we get to play a show together someday, because I am such a fan and so honored that you came on to do this. And thank you so much for your time and for your music. I am such an enormous fan, and it's had such an impact on me and my work. And thank you very much to Powell's for hosting this event. And thank you everyone for coming. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Ben. It was such a great talk. Very excited about the book. This is the book here. I put the link in the comments, and I'm going to hit the comment there. So click on that link I just put in the comments to order your book. And check out our events calendar for coming up, other events coming up, powells.com. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And thanks Michelle and Ben once again. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.